Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second panel in the Global Dialogue series. My name is Jisha Menon, and I am the Fisher Family Director of Stanford Global Studies. At the outset, let me thank our Global Dialogues team, Christine Jiang, Stephanie Pitkiewicz, Simrat Mathru, Kristen Hara, and Kate Kuhn for putting together this series. Global Dialogues is a new initiative at SGS, and it is aimed at fostering some fresh thinking around critical global issues. Each quarter, we convene a Global Dialogues panel that takes up pressing global issues under three large themes: crises, connections, and concepts. This quarter, our focus is on connections. And of course, without question, climate change in our environmental commons is at the forefront of these urgent issues that we confront today. Climate change allows us to rethink some of the foundational concepts of the humanities, including the category of the human. In the age of the Anthropocene, the human itself is conceived of as an agent of geological change. Climate change urges us to think of how we can imagine justice, responsibility, and the political in human worlds and beyond. Our panel today, Reimagining Environmental Futures, convenes three of the most creative and influential scholars working at the intersection of the humanities and environment studies. The work of these three scholars has been hugely impactful as we imagine new contours for the humanities as the question of the non-human environment decenters the very category of the human. This panel explores how we can imagine environmental futures while also contending with the persistent asymmetries and entrenched inequities that are the legacy of the conjoined histories of empire, capital, and climate change. Due to limited time, I will introduce each panelist briefly, but please find an extended bio in the Q&A feature. Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty is the Lawrence A. Kinton Distinguished Service Professor in History, South Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. He serves as the Faculty Director of the University of Chicago Center in New Delhi. He is one of the most influential intellectual and cultural historians and theorist of environment studies, post-colonial theory, and a founding member of the Subaltern Studies Collective. He's an award-winning author whose scholarship has created new fields and reshaped existing ones. His most recent book, The Climate of History in a Planetary Age, urges us to consider how categories of the global, with its human-centric construct of the globe, abrades against the planetary, which undoes the centrality of the human. And we'll hear more about this in a minute. We're also delighted to welcome back to Stanford our former colleague, Professor Ursula Heise, who is chair of the English department at UCLA and holds the Marcia H. Howard Chair in Literary Studies. She is founder and director of the Lab for Environmental Narrative Strategies at UCLA's Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. A leading theorist, scholar, and documentary film producer, her work bridges environment studies and the humanities, and her award-winning books such as Sense of Place and Sense of Planet, The Environmental Imagination of the Global, and Imagining Extinction have been foundational in reshaping the field of environment humanities. Her most recent work, Imagining Extinction, reminds us that questions of extinction, endangered species, and biodiversity cannot be categorized through neutral-sounding scientific categories. These are also profoundly cultural questions with deeply embedded histories and values. And finally, we have Professor Rob Nixon, who is the Barron Family Professor in the Humanities and the Environment at Princeton University. He's affiliated with the Princeton Environmental Institute's initiative in the environmental humanities. His nonfiction writing is a public intellectual, and his scholarship have been crucially formative to the field of post-colonial studies, and his award-winning and vastly influential Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor has alerted us to the representational challenges of slowly unfolding environmental catastrophes of long-term pollution, climate change, and nuclear fallout. For the past 25 years, Professor Nixon's intellectual focus has been on environmental justice struggles in the global South. Much of his work focuses on the relationship between accelerating rates of environmental change and rising rates of economic inequality. Professor Nixon also has an interest in the relationship between the artistic imagination and movements for social change. He's currently working on a book called Environmental Martyrs and the Defense of the Forest. Please join me in welcoming our three speakers. And to start us off, I will invite Professor Chakrabarty to offer some reflections.
Thank you, Jisha, for this invitation to speak on this panel. And it's a great honor to be speaking on a panel with my co-panelists, Rob Nixon and Ursula Heise, from whose work I've learned a lot, like everybody has, I guess, in this group and in the audience. So very quickly, thinking about futures, what I want to speak of is what I see as increasing fragmentation of human futures. So when I talk about fragmentation of human futures, let me speak about something in contrast to which I speak of what I see as the fact of fragmentation. See, when I was growing up, when I came into my adolescence in Calcutta, in India, and got interested in ideologies of socialism, of democracy, human rights, all these things, even liberalism, all of these were internationalist ideologies. And so the idea always was that there were historical differences, there were economic differences, all kinds of differences existed between human beings, between their institutions, but that somehow we would work through those differences on differentiated calendars, I mean, but to arrive at the same future, as it were. Even Marx in Capital Volume 1 wrote this sentence where he said, the industrialized countries of today show to the non-industrialized countries their future. So this idea that we would go through some historical time to get to the same future, it's in contrast to that vision of oneness of human future, which was part of all these modern internationalist ideologies, that I speak of a certain sense of fragmentation of that future. So the fragmentation, interestingly, comes from a paradox of entering an age where suddenly scientists were giving us visions of one future, like climate change, an uninhabitable planet. But that one future was also based on certain unitary calendars, which are planetary calendars. Sometimes, say the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, would speak of carbon budgets for the whole planet. And they might say, look, whatever the differences between nations and whatever bargaining you want to do between nations, you cannot emit more than so much carbon dioxide by such and such time if you want to keep the warming under a certain level. So suddenly, if you go back to the setting up of the United Nations after the war, the idea was that we will get to this one future, but we had an indefinite amount of time at our disposal to get to this future. So if you ask anybody, when would the Kashmir conflict be solved? When would the Palestinian conflict be solved? When would capitalism end? People would say, we have to struggle for these things. There's no fixed calendar. We don't know, but we have time. Yeah. In fact, one of the conditions that Kant talked about in that little essay in the Conflict of Faculties, asking where if humanity could go on improving forever, and one of the things he says, one of the four conditions is that if they're given sufficient time. But the whole question of temporality got skewed when we were suddenly confronted with a very short-term future, or at least seemingly short-term. For instance, I don't think he was right, but remember there was a book published by Martin Rees, the astrophysicist, who was the president of the Royal Society of Britain, predicting that humanity would be extinct in 100 years. So all these extinction scenarios of humans, we're suddenly confronted with other futures. And then if you think of the pandemic, which is definitely tied to the factors which also give rise to climate change, for instance, deforestation, that Fauci and Morans have been talking about, you could very clearly see that the pandemic itself creates peculiar kind of sense of future where the future we want to get to is really the past, the pre-pandemic situation. So even when we acknowledge that we'll never get back to the past before the pandemic, we're still waiting for in-person classes, in-person seminars, the travel we can undertake. So you can already see that there's a peculiar kind of future that the pandemic itself gives rise to. And that's what I mean, that there are multiple futures now. So there's a kind of Elon Musk vision of going to another planet, which is obviously not for everybody. Even within the pandemic, if you think of the demand, equal access to vaccination, which is a very legitimate demand, you can see that that comes out of that other older mode of thinking, that by addressing inequality, injustice, we will get to the same future for everybody. But if you think about the role of anti-vaxxers, the ideological resistance to vaccination, you can immediately see that human beings create these different futures. In a normal scenario, all those would have been elements against which you would struggle, given your ideology, to get to this one future. But the very sense of the oneness of the future and the oneness of time is paradoxically put into trouble by the scientific claim about the oneness of the planet. So the political tendency often, for instance, when climate when people, like for instance, when China or India say to the Western or the developed countries, you screwed up the planet, you polluted it, so you go and fix it while we still develop. Now, you could say that the politics of that is precisely to split the planet by the logic of history, by the logic of empire, by the logic of development and underdevelopment, so that we can get back to that original position of working through the differences. Except that we're under pressure now. Now China would say, give us at least 20 years, or India would say, give us 20 years before we stop using coal, or something like that, right? So there's a bargaining about, so there's the older vision that we would work through our differences to get to the same future for humanity all over, what I'm calling the internationalist visions of future, right? They are under pressure. They're sometimes compressed now by a calendar, and that's the bargaining that goes on with IPCC. And I think you can see that the temporal assumptions on which an institution like the United Nations was based, which is that there's in human terms indefinite amount of time at our disposal, because our time is not mixed up with geological time. We used to assume. But now that we know that our time is mixed up with geological time, that we are also affecting, biodiversity, the hydrological and the nitrogen and the carbon cycles of the planet, that we're also planetary, has created, has both fragmented futures for us, short-term, long-term. And the pandemic is a very good illustration of this fragmentation of futures, as well as put pressure on all the ideologies that I grew up with about those international ideologies, which actually made room for historical differences of income or resources of welfare, but where the differences were precisely what you want to address, but address them in order to get to the same type of future, right? I mean, so like this equal access to vaccination. The whole justice question is based on that kind of vision. So, I've got less than 2 minutes left, but I think I broadly said what I wanted to say. So maybe I'll stop here and take further questions when they come up, both while I look forward to Ursula and Rob's presentation. So, and I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dipesh. And this is actually, the transition is super easy. And it's really what I wanted to say is in some sense an elaboration of the central idea of your talk, which is the fragmentation of futures. And the first point that I'd like to make about that is that I think we need to apply that even to the idea of climate change itself. Climate change is the dominant concept that's mentioned in the description of this panel. But actually, when I think about environmental futures, and I'm glad that it is in the plural in our title, is that we're not just confronting climate change, we're confronting a whole set of interrelated environmental crises and changes that range from climate change to massively increased urbanization, to biodiversity loss, toxification, a massive waste problem, changing population futures with populations still growing in some parts of the world and decreasing in others, and so forth. And so climate change is often used as a shorthand for futures and environmental futures in particular. But I think it's worth being careful about that. Not everything is caused by climate change or related to it, even though everything will no doubt be touched by it. So let me sort of really just elaborate on Dipesh's ideas a little bit more by coming back to an old quote from Frederick Jameson's book Seeds of Time from the mid-1990s. That's often been quoted, and I'm sure you're all familiar with it, where Jameson says it seems to be easier for us today to imagine the thoroughgoing deterioration of Earth and of nature than the breakdown of late capitalism. Perhaps that's due to some weakness in our imaginations. And this is, for all of its now ancientness, this is sort of a line that stuck with me because I've always sort of disagreed with part of it and then agreed with one implication of it. Disagreed insofar as I, grew up in West Germany during the Cold War. So there were constant news and occasional visitors from Eastern Europe. I don't think that anybody in my generation growing up in Europe wasn't confronted with vivid images of social and economic forms of organization that were quite different from capitalism. So I sometimes have found myself wondering whether this is a particularly American predicament. And then in my more recent work with colleagues from Vietnam, Taiwan, and China, I also realized that, many people in East Asia have not had a problem thinking outside of capitalism. Many of them have lived through it or are living through some version of alternatives to it right now. So socialist and communist forms of governance with a limited commitment to capitalism. So the problem is, of course, that in neither of these scenarios was capitalism seen, were these alternatives to capitalism seen as viable options for the future. But what interested me about this is that in neither of these scenarios is capitalism the imaginative prison that Jameson describes it as. The other problem comes from my scholarly investment in the study of narrative and particularly speculative fiction. And there's a different problem that I think emerges with Jameson's statement in that context, in that just about every speculative novel that you can pick up from the last few decades, starting with Octavia Butler on to Margaret Atwood, Emily St. John Mandel, Claire Ray Watkins, Cormac McCarthy, Paolo Bacigalupi, whoever you're reading, nobody seems to have much of a problem imagining that capitalism can and will break down, along with, current systems of governance, justice, healthcare, education, transportation, and so on and so on. And nobody in that context has a problem imagining scenarios that are in significant respects worse than today. So, you have these corporate compounds and plea blends in Atwood's vision. You have in Bacigalupi and Lepucki and Howard Kunstler and in Watkins, these panoramas of social disintegration that then give rise to these small scale, often violent communities that only are focused on survival and often led by power hungry autocrats and gurus. What does seem to be really difficult to imagine in a lot of this fiction, and that's, I think, true also of the non-American versions of this, is coming up with visions of systems after the breakdown of capitalism that might be better for the earth and better for people. And very few writers and filmmakers, I think, even seriously try to do that. You have some sort of allegorical gestures toward that, like the emergence of a Gaia-like governance in David Brin's novel Earth, or that nonviolence contract between humans and the genetically engineered pigoons at the end of Atwood's Mad Adam. So very few writers attempt this, and it's admittedly really difficult because we're right now at a moment where I think the spectrum of futures just ranges widely, and it goes from, futures that we can envision at the present moment that look pretty good to other ones that look pretty close to apocalyptic. So in confronting that, I found myself struggling with the reimagining environmental futures in our title. We do need to reimagine, but I'm not sure that there's actually completely new ideas on the table. But rather an attempt to figure out what combinations of solutions might work in response to these variant ongoing crises. And one of the most interesting cases in point of how a writer has dealt with that in literature is Kim Stanley Robinson's novel, The Ministry for the Future, from late 2020. It's gotten a huge amount of attention. I'm sure many of you have at least looked at it, if not read all of its 600 pages. And it garnered Robinson an invitation to the COP26 conference last October. It has clearly resonated, even though it's a bit of an unusual novel. Some of the chapters in it read more like nonfiction prose than a speculative novel. You have chapters that read like political economy or political science or financial policy. And what it presents really, and this is where I think my thinking converges with Dipesh's, it presents a compendium of solutions, all the way from a UN ministry whose portfolio it is to advocate for future generations and for the non-humans, to the introduction of a carbon currency, to eco-terrorism that brings down fossil fuel executives, to re-engineering Antarctic ice sheets, to creating huge biodiversity reserves. So you have a huge range of different solutions there. And one chapter consists solely of a whole catalog of voices from dozens of countries from around the globe, who each briefly summarize some of their most successful initiatives or organizations in dealing with these crises. So this novel presents a catalog of solutions rather than one solution. And to the extent that there is one solution, it's one that Robinson had already proposed in earlier novels, a general strike of citizens on paying their debts, which then leads to a huge financial crash, which leads banks and corporations to ask for financial bailouts. And that bailout is granted to them only on condition that they surrender at least 51% of their shares to national government. So it's old style sort of socialization. So pretty standard social democratic or socialist imagination of what might solve current problems. But what's interesting about the novel, I think, in view of this fragmentation of futures that Dipesh has talked about, is really how there's, on one hand, yes, there is this socialization of important economic institutions, and there is a ministry that is a UN ministry that is still a global institution that is then a bit in tension with and sort of rubs up against the idea that there is not one solution for these crises, but many different ones, and that the imagination of the future needs to include financial and monetary tools, new technologies, new laws, different social movements, and so on and so forth. So it is not one environmental future for the whole planet. That's what so strongly resonates, I think, in Robinson's novel with what Dipesh has said. So whatever environmental futures we seek to imagine needs to be tied to particular problems, circumstances, institutions, and networks. Obviously that's where the dimension of justice really comes in, and how justice itself has been that unifying principle, but also has to be, of course, imagined as part of different cultural frameworks, narratives, and historical memories. So the focus, I think, that we can take away from that novel is, what futures can we keep open for particular communities, opening rather than foreclosing options for the future? And how can we sort of manage what Jason Moore has called the end of cheap nature that could preclude that, with Mike Hume's idea that climate change and the other environmental crises could present opportunities. And this is also, and I don't have time to talk about this now, but it's translated in very interesting ways in this novel into the parallax structure that was common in high modernist modes of storytelling. So a lot of different voices, a lot of different perspectives that get combined to then project what is a branching of environmental futures, and also a multiple branching of ideas about justice. So I'll pass it on to Rob.
Great, thank you, Ursula. We didn't coordinate at the outset, but obviously there's a baton to be picked up, and I was glad that Ursula made the entree into speculative fiction. So what I wanted to talk a little bit about is speculative nonfiction. There's obviously a lot of debate around the question of cli-fi, the viability of cli-fi, whether, starting with Amitav Ghosh, cli-fi is substantive enough or even imaginative enough to engage with the questions of climate change and the Anthropocene. But there hasn't been very much attention on what we might call climate nonfiction, and so I wanted to think a little bit about that. And the question that prompted me to think this was, how can we create a scientifically plausible history of the future? And so the distinction I would make here is between possible futures and plausible futures. So the list of speculative fiction writers that Ursula gave us, those are figures who are working without imaginative constraints. In other words, all they have to do is to say, follow me into this world that I'm imagining. That world does not have to be a plausible world, but it is an imaginatively feasible world. So when we come to nonfiction writers writing about climate change and the Anthropocene, there is an obligation to make those worlds plausible. And so the typical pathway is to create an arc from the present, the material conditions of the present, towards the future. A very common destination is 2050, but sometimes it's the end of the 21st century. And the idea is to adhere to the best available data and to turn that data into, to infuse it with a narrative energy and with a sensory specificity. So if we think about a cli-fi novel, a work of speculative fiction like Kim Stanley Robinson's 2140, it can be read simply as a jolt to the imagination. It does not need to be plausible. That would not, a lack of plausibility would not be a failing in that work. But if we think about a work of cli-non-fi or speculative nonfiction, like Heidi Cullen's The Weather of the Future, what she's doing is starting with the present and animating the data from the present towards a point in the middle of the century. And so she's not arguing that what she's describing is a probable future, but it is stronger than a possible future. It has to be a plausible future because she's effectively bearing witness to a future that hasn't yet happened, but which she is confident enough that she can document within certain limits by following the data. This is a third book that also deals with rising waters, and this is by the journalist Jeff Goodall. And he does something a little bit similar to Heidi Cullen in this work of speculative nonfiction. He follows the data and he tries to map it onto future worlds. And here's a sample passage. After the hurricane hit Miami in 2037, a foot of sand covered the famous bow tie floor in the lobby of the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami Beach. A dead manatee floated in the pool where Elvis had once swum. Most of the damage came not from the hurricane's 175-mile-an-hour winds, but from the 20-foot storm surge that overwhelmed the low-lying city. In South Beach, historic Art Deco buildings were swept off their foundations. Mansions on Star Island were flooded up to their cut glass doorknobs. Okay, so here he's studied the available projections, and he has isolated this as a plausible scenario, and he's then given it immediate textures, which are typically a mix of what people who have visited Miami Beach know about Miami, plus the scientific data projected onto this particular locale turned into sensory experience. So it's a sense of future retrospective, and what this does, I think, both in the case of climate non-fi and climate non-fi and non-fi that addresses the Anthropocene, is to try to place pressure on current actions by mapping out their implication for plausible futures. So there's a whole slew of Klein non-fi that fits this pattern. Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway's The Collapse of Western Civilization. Their endpoint is late in the 21st century, so they take it a little further out. Storms of My Grandchildren, James Hansen. He not only tries to see the present from the perspective of an intergenerational perspective, not only in terms of the burdens that the grandchildren will be inheriting, but he tries towards the end of the book to conjure that world. In other words, to take us immersively into that future, which he has tracked according to the data. So, with a surge of Klein non-fi and Anthropocene driven non-fi, we can track some of this back to the big oil scenarios that Shell started producing in the early 70s, and other big oil corporations soon followed suit, Exxon, BP, and so forth. And in those scenarios, the big oil corporations would typically create two trajectories, coming out of the present into the future. If this happens, if the price of oil goes up, this is likely to happen. If a lot of governments decide to rapidly transition to renewables, this will happen. So there's a forked set of pathways, and these were typically converted into videos and often were part of the strategy of greenwashing. Now, a similar kind of bifurcated narrative is something that we find in The Future We Choose by Christiana Figueres and Tom Rivett-Carnac, who have both been very active in the planning of the COP conferences, and partly because of their frustration at the gap between the data and the way that data has only in very limited ways impacted public policy. They decided to write a public book in which they map out two pathways to 2050. One is the pathway of business as usual, which ends in a catastrophic place, which they evoke in some detail. And the other is a pathway that accords to rapid decarbonization and the shift to renewables. And that leads to a more harmonious 2050. So that you can see with the bifurcation, the optional narratives, they're both placing pressure on our choices that we make in the present, and they are, in a sense, borrowing from the corporate model of two scenarios. So when we get to the Anthropocene, we're very often the future orientation is much further out. You may be dealing with centuries or millennia, but definitely not 2050, which tends to be the sweet spot for Klein non-fi. And so, for instance, in the collection that Greg Mittman and others edited, Future Remains, you can see in the top right-hand corner a future remain of a blackberry found in the mud. Okay, so it's the present fossilized. So we're talking about much longer stretches of time. And so what this means, we just give a couple more examples. The Earth After Us, where the geologist speculates into a world beyond humanity. Similarly, Alan Wiseman's bestseller, The World Without Us, is taking us through nonfiction into much more distant futures. And so one of the implications of this, and we see it very clearly in Diane Ackerman's The Human Age, another book about the Anthropocene, one of the implications of this is that beyond a certain temporal limit, speculative fiction and speculative nonfiction begin to merge. And so, for instance, in the Diane Ackerman, she creates a fictional character within her non-fictional text. She calls that character Olivine. And Olivine is a geologist who arrives on Earth 10,000 years from now and tries to reconstruct archaeologically and geologically, tries to reconstruct the way humanity is now, the way we're living now, from the remains, okay? But once you get 10,000 years out, you're effectively not really dealing with plausible futures anymore. You're pretty much sliding over into the realm of speculative nonfiction. And so just one final point is at Princeton, I've been involved in an interdisciplinary course that is effectively a work of speculative nonfiction. So what we have is something called the environmental nexus. And we brought together a life scientist, an environmental ethicist, an environmental economist, and then I was doing literature and the arts. And we targeted the year 2050. And we targeted what we saw as the 4 critical issues, the 4 critical challenges between now and 2050. And those are addressing biodiversity, climate breakdown, food security, and water security. So each of us would reflect on each of those themes from our particular disciplinary angles. But the point I wanted to make here and how it connects to the idea of speculative nonfiction is that we each would chart sort of business as usual from 2022 to 2050. And then we would present, as in the corporate scenarios, we would present alternative trajectories with different variables, okay? So that even in the literary and arts section, what we were looking at is the data and how that data could be animated and transformed into felt experience so that we enter into the distant future, a year like 2050, from the perspective of inhabiting that. And clearly, part of our motivation in setting up that course was that by 2050, most of our undergraduates would be at the height of their powers and also in a position of potentially heightened vulnerability in relation to climate impacts. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. These are extraordinary reflections, and you've given us a lot to think about. I do want to invite the audience to post their questions in the Q&A feature you'll find at the bottom of your screen. To get us started off, maybe one of the things that I thought was really interesting for us to think about is this idea, as Dipesh mentioned, how do you move forward as a collective agent with awareness of our shared environmental futures, but at the same time be cognizant to not erase historical responsibility, including histories of racism, slavery, and violent dispossession. That seems to be like a kind of point of tension. How does the call to this collective agency maybe let corporations off the hook for the role they play in benefiting from these carbon-intensive technologies, or does it exonerate them from harming those who have suffered adverse effects? So that question of justice seems to come up repeatedly. So how can we think both about how we can come together in this moment of climate emergency, but also not, think about the historical, injustices that have brought us to this moment. So maybe, Dipesh, if you could start us off by offering some thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. No, very interesting, fascinating discussion, and then interesting listening to Rob's last remarks, because we're doing something similar in Chicago. I'm sure you're doing something similar in Stanford. There's clearly a sense across universities now that we have to educate citizens of the future in a different way. And you know, the interesting difference always is between the classroom as a space of discussion and what happens to discussion when you go outside the classroom. So, you know, the classroom is a space where you logically bracket issues that would produce conflict, sometimes unresolvable conflict. In classrooms, when you get to a point of unresolvable conflict, you kind of agree to disagree. That space allows for that. Whereas in reality, and when you get outside the classroom, that's where the pluriverse, the human pluriverse, can also become a conflictual pluriverse. Whereas the pluriverse of the classroom is a tamed pluriverse. And I think these exercises are all very important, but you know, there's a perennial question of how do we, you know, students from the same classroom would eventually emerge on the right, on the left, at different positions, even if they share perspective. So I think Rob's question implicitly raises a very important issue of what can universities do, what can we do as teachers, and I think what Ursula was showing with reading Phi, Rob was showing with reading Non-Phi, are all very important things pedagogically. But you're asking a question that goes beyond the classroom. And there I find, honestly, personally, I find it unpractical. Well, I mean, I find there's a kind of quandary that the moment we speak of a we. What should we do? The moment we act, we realize there's not a we. So the human we has the same structure as, you know, in that statement attributed to Aristotle, oh, my friend, there's no friend. You know, oh, humanity, there's no humanity. Right? So the moment you go out, that we splits. So there's this, so there I find, in fact, in one of his later essays, Achille Mbembe writes about this interestingly as kind of an exercise of, it's a constant exercise of trying to be together, being together, while knowing that it's very difficult to be together. And this is where the question of justice, the question of power, people who can implement their preferences far more powerfully than people who can't. I mean, this is a question we face all the time. And then if you look at the reason why I call it fragmentary futures, you look at your own, I mean, look, I'm in my early 70s now, and I think of retirement. And I think of maybe living, if I'm very lucky, another 20 years, but probably not. And I think of what will happen to my retirement investments. My Australian retirement, the academic sort of superannuation is the only organization that talks about climate risks. I have not found anything in the TIACF literature that actually talks about climate risk to your investment, right? So most of us are deniers. Even when I think about retirement, the retirement associations encourage us not to think about climate change, or think about climate change as just another investment option. And nor do I want to confront that future, honestly, because it's so scary. That's what I mean. So what I meant by a deep fragmentation of futures is that there's a kind of denialism which comes out of the desire to exist in the face of a reality, which, as Rob was saying, if you go by the hard data, the evidence, I mean, the reality is dystopic. And at the same time, you know, recently I was involved in a discussion of the term apocalypse in the contemporary context. And François Hartog very usefully pointed it out that it's an extremely sort of, you know, the Judeo-Christian Islamic concept. And so he was actually pointing out that Bruno Latour technically is an apocalyptic thinker, but a heretic one, because he thinks you can live beyond apocalypse, that you can fight against apocalypse and go beyond it. So Hartog had a funny sentence where he said he thinks that the Inquisition would have been interested in Latour's case as an apocalyptic thinker. But at the same time, when I go to India or China, particularly India, where there's a very old Hindu Indic tradition of thinking that out of destruction comes creation. There's simply not the same attitude towards this impending disaster. You know, and I think, I'm not saying that's the only reason why they don't care, but it definitely contributes to this overall sense of, you know, I mean, they've always lived in disaster, always coped with disaster, always coped with uncertainty. Indians pride themselves on being on being improvisers of the world, right? Like the poor. So that's why I'm saying that it's such a complex problem that we face, that it's a problem that we've never faced before. And I'm not even sure that we were equipped to face it. Yeah, in terms of our institutional imaginations, in terms of how we've grown. I mean, we have very few memories of having really, humanity has lived for the most part through an ice age. But all our memories that have to do with civilization, you know. So future is an extremely interesting, complicated question. I'm simply saying that it simply doesn't hold together in the way that my old internationalist ideologies, with which I grew up, about democracy, about liberalism, about human rights, about socialism, made it look like it would hold together. That the confidence with which Marx would write that the industrialized nations of today mirror the future of the countries not industrialized. The reason why historians numbered industrial revolution, if you go history books, the first industrial revolution, the second industrial revolution, as if they're all sort of, you know, in a series. Right? And you just have to number them. That vision of future has become unsustainable. And we're all struggling in different ways to create multiple futures over which the unanswerable of the question of the we hovers.
Great. Would Rob or Ursula like to offer some thoughts?
Sure, I can just say that, I mean, I think one of the things about the selective Enlightenment, you know, going back to the 18th century, is that there was a lot of pseudo-universals floating around. So that, you know, initially when democracy was introduced in the UK, it was democracy for 5% of the population. I mean, let alone the colonized populations under the British Empire, but it was just a certain stratum of white propertied men who were presented as having universal suffrage. And so that the question, sometimes the trajectory of the universal has involved these sleights of hand, you know, universal for who? And I think that, as you're rightly saying, Dipesh, that has come to a sort of a head with the impossibility of a universal response to climate breakdown. And, you know, you alluded also earlier to the COVID scenario, where we saw the limits of the idealism of philanthro-billionaires in terms of similar discriminatory patterns of access playing out in this question of the we. You know, everybody needs to get their first shot before everybody gets their second shot. Well, that the charitable we, all the creeks and all the joints were exposed by COVID because the rollout was so very not universal.
I would just second something that you brought up with regard to India, and which I've sort of seen in Vietnamese and Taiwanese friends. I mean, I don't think there is this shared sense of apocalypse coming. Where on the contrary, I mean, in Vietnam, you know, there's still a sense of exuberance. I mean, before the pandemic, at any rate, a sense of exuberance about the new possibilities, about women actually running companies, and so forth. So not to everybody is climate change and an apocalypse, which at any rate is just, I think, a metaphor for the end of a certain way of life. I mean, I think that's where the Judeo-Christian connotations of that term come in and sort of obfuscate what's really going on. And what, you know, when you look at the scenarios that fiction and nonfiction writers paint when they talk about apocalypse, it's not the end of the world, and it's certainly not the end of humanity, let alone the planet. It's the end of a certain way of life. And so I think that's important to remember. It's actually not a universal end. It's an end of particular ways of doing things, and it might make room for other practices and other ways of life. That's sort of where I do retain a modicum of optimism. I have to admit that it's been battered by the experience of COVID and the absolute impossibility to get people to agree on basic facts, even in the face of their own family members, going to hospital and dying. I mean, people refusing to have COVID put on the death certificate of their dad who just passed away from it. That does blow my mind. But on the other hand, is that so new? I mean, and do we really have to agree with? I mean, maybe we have to agree on facts. We don't have to agree with people on basic ideology necessarily to confront some of the more urgent problems. And maybe this is a consequence of living in California, but I also do see new we's emerging, where there are new we's around the question of homelessness. City of LA just outlawed future oil drilling and will decommission all oil wells within city limits. That for a long time was unthinkable. The California state government now does not issue any environmental laws and policies that do not have provisions for disadvantaged communities. So there are these new we's and new coalitions and alliances issues. And I think that's something to work on, rather than thinking that we can bring everybody on the planet together to confront, something like climate change. For some people, it may be a lot more important to sort of, come up with a recycling system so they can get the plastic out of their immediate environment and out of the just burning stuff in your backyard. I was very struck by that traveling to Indonesia a few years ago, where there's heaps of trash on the beaches, along the streets, everywhere, because there's no sanitation, right? So you can see how being in that kind of environment, climate change is a bit of a more remote problem than dealing with having access to sanitation, clean water, recycling, trash pickup, those kinds of things. So maybe we don't always need to address climate change as the first and foremost. Maybe there are other things we can work on within the realm of what's possible to us. And that's also where I see the function of the university, is to give students sort of trajectories and narratives where they can become engaged, not with saving the planet, or combating climate change. They're not going to be able to do that, but they can become involved in concrete measures that will make local environments better, and in a lot of cases will then also contribute to the improvement of global environments. So I resist the pessimism that's always implicit in apocalypse, because maybe it's a good thing if we have an apocalypse of capitalism. Other things might emerge from that, and maybe part of our task is to try and begin to imagine what that might look like.
Can I say something about that?
Yes,
It's just, no, I mean, I think what Ursula is saying is right. It's just that I also think that what she says echoes Roy Scranton's point in Learning to Die, was really learning to have a certain way of lifetime. But you see, while a matter of learning to die is a matter of learning for some people, it's actually a matter of dying for some other people. So even if capitalism suffers and runs into crisis, the price will be paid by the poor around the world. So I mean, India at the moment, I mean, I was in Kerala recently, and the sea levels are rising. So the poor people, particularly women who cook, are finding it difficult to cook with the water that's available near their places, because it's all getting brackish. So they have to walk much further to actually get, this is near the coast, to get fresh water with which to cook. And the issue doesn't rise to political level. So if you go and talk to them, they'll talk about it, but it's not a political issue. So the price is already being paid at an everyday level for the crisis of the civilization we have built. What I find fascinating in what you're saying, Ursula, and I guess what we're all saying, is that as a historian, I think it's such a novel point in human history where our response is really to climate scientists to say, okay, fine, but suspend the planet for a while. Let me look at the local. Let me look at what I can do. Just bracket the planetary.
Mm.
And it's another way of saying that we can't politically handle the planetary. I mean, scientists might create all kinds of, they might make all sorts of statements about the planetary, but it's not amenable to human politics.
Mm.
And that in itself is a fascinating problem of human politics. You know, the nature of what we call the political. I mean, however you think about it, it is a crisis that really forces you to think about what is the political. And there's one question coming up in the, if I may quickly address
Yes,
it,
sure.
of indigenous futurisms and
Yes.
Afrofuturisms.
I was actually going to just raise that question. Yeah.
So, you know, I don't work with that literature, but let me just pick up one strand, which interests me and which I've read a little bit into, and that's the Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro's work on Amerindian perspectivism, Amerindian multinaturalism, you know, fascinating stuff. But you know, there are two things I want to say. The first one is that when you look at that work, sometimes there's a too great a separation made between, let's say, indigenous thought world and European thought world. But at least in the case of De Castro, his reading of the indigenous thought world comes out of May 68 in Paris. And it's profoundly influenced by Deleuze and Guattari. And particularly the third chapter in Anti-Oedipus and chapter 12 in Thales and Plato, which themselves are indebted to Pierre Cluster's work, anarchist work, Society Against the State. So there's a peculiar way in which, and you remember sort of when Foucault writes his foreword to Anti-Oedipus, Foucault says, prefer multiplicity over uniformity. Multiplicity is the way to go. And of course, what they find, and there's no, I'm not disputing it, in the indigenous thought world is a certain value given to multiplicity, which is why multinatural, right? Not uninatural. But first of all, there's this imbrication of European thinking, and that's been going on. I mean, if you read those chapters in Anti-Oedipus on the barbarians, who are they reading? They're reading all the anthropological stuff produced from Africa, from Latin America. So there is already a conversation going on between the indigenous and the European. So I sometimes, you know, there are strands of decolonial thinking which want to make a very sharp distinction. And I think there are strands in decolonial thinking where the connections are acknowledged or are more obvious. But here I come to De Castro's point, where De Castro actually says, either in the book that he did with his wife, Deborah Donowski, called The Ends of the World, or in his book on cannibal metaphysics, where he actually says that it's only, basically, it's in a post-catastrophic world with, I'm trying to remember verbatim, it's a post-catastrophic world with diminished capabilities in which the indigenous thought would become a resource. So there's this question, if you have 10 billion people to feed and people living in cities with, and you can't avoid long supply chains, because in the Amartya Sen kind of argument that if you have famine in one part of the world, and if you can't rush food and medicine to that part of the world, you're condemning people to death. So I think the question of indigenous futurism, I mean, there's absolutely no dispute that there's a lot to learn from indigenous societies, because they were far more sustainable societies that human beings ever built than the societies we've built with modern civilization. But at the same time, the end product of the modern civilization is that you are talking about at least 10 billion people. And you are talking about feeding them, clothing them. And so De Castro's solution that it's only in a post-catastrophic, diminished world with diminished capacity scares me. I kind of think, but what happens before we get to that catastrophe? I mean, what role would your indigenous thinking play in that intervening period? And that's not a rhetorical question. I'm not saying it won't play any role, because all the settler colonial societies were built on indigenous knowledge, right? And again, there you find that a lot of medical knowledge is built on indigenous knowledge. And there's not a sharp divide like that. So, but
David Graeber has now argued that actually a good deal of Enlightenment thought might be derived from Amerindian thought, right? In the dawn of everything. But okay.
But okay, but
scant evidence. I agree.
Yeah, exactly. No, all I'm saying is that the
Continue.
world has been, thoughts have been mingling for such a long time that to create very sharp divides today seem, to use Rob's term, implausible, though possible.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, just to briefly pick up on the question of indigenous futurism, I mean, a number of leading indigenous thinkers, like I'm thinking of Leanne Simpson saying, that the world has always been ending for somebody, some people somewhere. That the idea of the disastrous ending is not novel, and Karl Powers-White as well, has talked about for the Potawatomi, who were forcibly removed from the Great Lakes region, from Michigan down to Oklahoma. He said the hottest day in Potawatomi history was the day we arrived in Oklahoma. So the sense of having embedded in indigenous histories some version of apocalyptic accommodation, if you want to use that word, is something that a number of the indigenous thinkers return to.
Ursula, would you like to offer some thoughts on this question that's coming up again and again about indigenous futurism?
No, I don't really want to add to the. Oh,
yeah, sorry to butt in. I have to go to a memorial. Can I? Please?
Yes. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks.
Thank you. Very good. I'm very sorry that I can't stay. Okay. Yeah. Bye-bye. Stay well, everybody. Bye.
You too. Thank you.
I wanted to pick up on another strand, actually, something that you said about, that we can't handle the planetary politically. I would totally agree with that, but I would add the word yet. And I mean, when you look at the history of what we now have as major collective actors, nation states, well, many of them, of course, none of them started out as nation states. I mean, it took very sustained political, social, and cultural work over centuries to crystallize out what is now called Italy or what is now called Germany, right? I mean, for centuries, those were principalities and dukedoms and tiny fragmented units that gradually, and then sometimes through, turns of military or political engineering, came together as nations. So this, and now we take this so for granted that we don't even think about the division of the world in those terms anymore, unless, somebody amasses 130,000 troops on somebody else's borders. So that's where I guess I'm a little bit more optimistic than Dipesh is. I think we should not necessarily give up on institutions of collective agency. That's what I found interesting about Kim Stanley Robinson's novels, both of the last ones, the New York 2140 and the Ministry for the Future, is that there isn't a giving up on global institutions and global forms of agency, but there's also a consciousness that those are not in their final form, and those are not at present in a state where they can deal with these crises that are surrounding us efficiently. But does that mean we should give up on the idea of such institutions? I think not. And I think that's where some of the really boring institutional committee-based work takes place, where you sit down with the people that you don't agree with and try to hammer out solutions, or at least processes and mechanisms whereby you can make decisions. So I just think I wouldn't bury those global institutions, knowing that they're never gonna supersede difference, and always going to be places where difference of political, cultural, historical kinds will have to be negotiated. But I think that can remain an objective, even as we're acutely conscious that currently they offer solutions that are not fast enough to deal with some of the crises that we're confronting.
Great. Well, we're out of time, unfortunately, but we have a ton of questions that are really interesting, and we will make sure that our panelists receive a copy of all of the questions that have given us a lot to think about. And thank you to Ursula, Rob, and Dipesh for joining us for this incredibly fruitful and thought-provoking panel, and hope to continue the conversation on other forums as well.
Thank you, Jisha.
Thanks, Jisha.